Hello and welcome to Banjo Strings and Drinking Boards, the podcast of the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rachel. Today we are discussing the 17th century. A big topic, an interesting topic, and one that is incredibly influential in the development of the future United States. A century many historians have argued is a transitional century that through warfare, political instability, and climate change, also commercial expansion due to colonization, led to changes that resulted in the formation of the modern world we live in today. However, there are a lot of historians who would disagree with the last sentence, and I tend to agree with this viewpoint because one can argue that every century is a formative century, and it will be hard to prove one century is more important than another in the creation of the modern world we live in today. My co-presenter, on the other hand, is totally on board with the 17th century being a transitional and formative century. Right, Alex?
Well, possibly. I have always had a strange fascination for the 17th century. Mainly, I think it has taken my whole life to figure out the English Civil War, or the War of the Three Kingdoms, and I think I am almost there. This will date me, but when I was in college, I was taught that the 17th century was a pivotal century in the formation of the modern world. The 17th century was when feudalism and the medieval world ended and a more capitalistic and bourgeoisie world emerged. A viewpoint that I know was popular among Marxist historians and for the most part, has been completely refuted by today. A key point, as medieval historians will point out, is the definition of feudalism, or is feudalism even a thing? And when you start saying this is when capitalism developed, there are all sorts of examples that you can point to, especially in the Italian states like Venice and Florence in the 15th and 16th century. I once heard the classic historian Mary Bede argue that for the overwhelming majority of people, life does not change much at all from the Roman world all the way up to the 19th century and the dawn of industrialization.
Wait, why are we discussing this again?
Well, because they're now beginning to go back and say that perhaps this was a pivotal century. There is a great book by Jeffrey Parker called Global Crisis, where he looks at the whole 17th century and realizes not just a European, but worldwide, there seems to be a century of much warfare, change in dynamics among all sorts of different states. A good example is China changes. It's one of the few centuries where there's a complete regime change, a failure of the rice crop, and millions of people are dying. You can also argue that Europe, when you look at it as a whole, there is only 2 years where states are not fighting other states. And he puts it down to the fact that the climate was changing, crops were failing, and leaders were incapable of dealing with the situation, and society began to break down, and they latched out, and that's where you start having a bunch of constant warfare. I thought it was a great book. A lot of people will take a lot of what he said and argue that will argue the point he is trying to make in this book. But it does get back to, is this a change century? Is this where things begin to really change for the better? Because when you look at it, and this is something that through this podcast, when you look at it, the 17th century was not a great time. And the world we live in today is a much better time. And perhaps the reason because of that was the actions that failed to happen in the 17th century led to where we are today.
All right, so obviously we need to break this down. We have a lot of different topics that you just mentioned very quickly. So why don't we start with climate? How do we know that the climate was changing, that the climate was so different and getting colder and causing down the line cascading failures in economics and basically daily life?
We know that by looking back. In the 17th century, they would not have known this. But one of the things that becomes very obvious is that the yields that they're developing per crops are failing. And there's a lot more crop failures in the 17th century. And when there's a crop failure, it can lead to famine and starvation. In a simple case, in the 1690s, there was a series of bad winters from about 1690 to 1694. Conditions in Scotland were very bad. A lot of the land that used to be farmed has stopped being farmed. France suffered crop failures, and historians believe over 2 million people might have died. I think one of the biggest examples of this in the mid-17th century in China, the rice crop fails. And that causes all sorts of problems. And again, millions and millions of people have died. Another example why we know this is the art of the time. And it's very interesting this is the period of Dutch landscape paintings. And when you look at it, you will notice that in a lot of the paintings, there's always clouds and it always looks like the weather is about to be stormy or something's going on. But there's a whole series of different paintings. And we have some that are right in front of us, which we're going to look at and try to visually describe them. They are not romantic in any sort of sense of the way. Or we can debate that. I showed one to Rachel and she thought it was romantic. So the first one we're going to look at, a Dutch landscape painting in 1664 by Philippus Konik. And it has a lot of clouds on it, and it looks like a storm is coming. And there has been a lot of studies on these paintings that were done in the 17th century, and they all seem to have different clouds in them or ominous-looking clouds. And this is a perfect example of that. And the next picture we have, I'll have Rachel describe.
Oh, wonderful. You give me the nicest things. So this is a Jan Bierstraten painting from circa 17th century. I don't know if there's actually a date on this one. It's the village of Nieuwkoop in winter with a child funeral. So this one, again, very ominous clouds in the background. There's more color to it, a little bit more warmth to the church. Obviously sending some Christian imaging here that the church is still your salvation, still your sense of hope. And you have a stream of mourners all wearing dark, obviously going to the churchyard with the unfortunately dead child. Then you also have an entire set of people on the frozen river. Some are skating. They're off in the background. In the foreground, however, you have what looks like rather ominous, maybe elders gathered around, all talking, discussing life. It's not a very happy painting. It's definitely still a little bit warmer, probably to distract from the ominous impact of the fact that children were dying.
And the next picture, where I'm not quite sure of the artist, but it is, again, a 17th century picture from the Netherlands. Again, it's a frozen river. Amsterdam is in the background. But the thing I like it is you have peasants carrying bundles of sticks, which they have gathered from the forest. And usually they call them, in England, they would call them faggots. And then they're burning them by the river. And on the river, you have someone who has fallen down and doesn't look like they're in great shape. And off in the corner, it could be that someone is ice fishing, they're catching fish, and there's a lot of boats that are just stuck and frozen in the river. And the thing that's interesting, in the 21st century, these rivers never, ever freeze over. This is something you really do not see from the mid-19th century to the present day.
All right, and continuing our depressing theme of winter paintings, again, this is from the 1660s. It's just a winter landscape by Claes Molenaar. And again, frozen river, some of the river's been hacked up for ice. Not that you really need it. If you go back to one of our earlier podcasts, you can actually hear about how things were actually freezing in houses because they couldn't manage to keep warm enough. But this is a rather rundown house, completely covered in ice, not snow, ice. And there are people, again, on the river. It looks like there are some kids playing. Looks like they're playing some form of stickball. You even have a horse and wagon on the ice. It's actually not even a wagon, it's a sledge. So it's not quite a sleigh. It has more like bladed ice skates on the bottom of where you sit and are drawn by the horse. So obviously these people have adapted and are prepared. But again, the color choice, very depressing. Everyone's very much dressed, covered, wearing lots of layers. Obviously, by the 1660s, a continual winter.
And the next one we're looking at is pictures. There are two pictures, and they're the 1683 to 1684 Frost Fair that took place on the Thames in London. And the first one which we're not sure of the artist. I think it's actually the same as the next one. You can see London Bridge in the background. You can see little rings where I know they're doing things like bear baiting, cockfights, or even, strangely enough, the English like bare-fisted boxing at this time. And there's a lot of activity on it, including carriages going across the Thames, which is interesting. So it becomes like a big highway. You don't have to go through crowded London Bridge to get to the other side of the river. And the other one, again, is the same picture. It's The Great Frost Fair by Jan Griffer, 1683 to 1684. And it just looks pretty miserable. Lots of clouds in the sky. It's not just a smooth, icy river. It's like chunks of ice, like almost like icebergs in the Thames, which if you've ever been to England in winter today, this would be a complete change. One thing that people will say is the river has gotten a lot narrower. It flows a lot faster than it did in this time period. It's a tidal river. But still, to have it freeze for, and I know in the 1683, 1684 frost, they had the frost fair over 6 weeks on the river, is an absolute incredible phenomenon that you just do not see in modern day Europe today.
I will say that what strikes you when you're looking at the difference between the Dutch paintings set in Holland and the English frost fair is that the English frost fair has a general sense of maybe a miserable frivolity, that they're out there, they're having fun. The Dutch paintings are all about daily life, about continuing with your tasks, trying to survive. The English are setting up fairs. They have merchants. They have food tents. They're actually, in this last one, the Great Frost Fair, they're actually cooking on top of the river, which can be done. My favorite festival in Minnesota, in Plymouth, is the Fire and Ice Festival, where we have bonfires on the ice. It's not unknown that water can freeze that much, or that rivers can freeze that much. But the English are turning this into a sense of, let's have some fun while we're at it, while we're suffering. So there's a big difference in also the approach to how you deal with this.
And some of the other reasons why we know that it's getting colder, in our worst year podcast, we discussed in England 1648 to 1652, where they had a series of bad winters. It's right after the Civil War. There's not much work to be found. People are very desperate. And that's when the number of indentured servants picks up dramatically heading towards Virginia and Jamaica. Another example where we know that things are amiss is when they first arrived in Jamestown. They're arriving into a big, big drought. They're having a tough time growing food, but so are the Indians are having a tough time growing food. There also seems to be, and this is, we had a speaker come, and one of the things he was mentioning, there was a lot of turmoil going on in the Indian world, American Indian world at this time, where a lot of the groups are moving south because the ability to grow corn in the northern climates is being reduced because of how short the growing season is. And that's causing a lot of stress among all Indians. And there is a theory that Powhatan and the position that he is taking on might have been a defensive position because they are concerned about other Indians from the north coming down and trying to steal their lands. So that's the situation that they're coming into. And also when they're going into Plymouth or into the New England colonies, again, something dramatic had happened beforehand because they are coming into an area that is very much devoid of as many people. A lot of that is through smallpox, but a lot of times where we've been discussing this and in our London plague one, is when people are malnourished, they're more likely to be susceptible to other diseases. And there is a theory that because the crops are failing, that these Indians might have been suffering from malnourishment, therefore causing them to have smallpox.
All right, so using our own rubric for worst years being on a global scale and affecting more than one culture, I will grant you that it does seem like climate and the changes in the 17th century did make a significant impact. So we'll take climate off. I'm still not certain that the entire century as a whole could be considered as formative, but I'll grant you climate.
the next thing that the 17th century, it's a century of warfare. And there are some really key wars. One of the ones is the 30 Years' War, which starts in 1618. It starts off kind of slow, but it sort of drags almost all the European powers into play. And it's a misunderstood war. I can honestly tell you, I don't think I completely understand all aspects of it, but it does start off as the Catholic Habsburgs trying to push back against the growing Protestant states. And especially when the Elector of the Palatinate, Frederick, goes into become the Emperor of Bohemia. His wife happens to be Elizabeth Stuart. So there is a thought that this war might bring the English into it, but it doesn't. The 30 Years' War, in certain areas, over half of the population dies. The Palatinate, especially around the city of Heidelberg, gets taken over many times and is completely devastated. Germany does not recover from this war in the 17th century. Before going into that war, the German-speaking areas in Central Europe were some of the most wealthiest areas and at that time period, and this war sort of puts them on the back burner for the rest of the century. One of the people who are going to benefit is France. France is supported, surprisingly a Catholic state, is supporting the Protestant. Their natural enemy are the Habsburgs, who are at this time are controlling Spain, and they are the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and also control the lands around Austria and Hungary. And interestingly, France during this time has a period in the middle of the 17th century where the nobility are trying to force back from the monarchy, but Louis XIV goes the other way and becomes an absolute monarch, the divine right of kings, and rules France with an iron fist really for the latter part of the century, and spent most of his time fighting all of his neighbors over and over again, and at times has an army of 200 to 300, maybe even up to 500,000 men. The key that is on this fact is not that he's at war. If you have an army that big, you are going to have a big state to be able to supply that army with clothes, with weapons, and to utilize them in a way that they don't turn on you. And so that also is very strong in the development of a very modern, strong state, a more authoritative method than what is going to be happening in England. Now going to England, England begins to fall apart in the middle part of the 17th century and eventually are going to end in the Civil War. The English Civil Wars, or as some historians like to say, the War of the Three Kingdoms, are some of the most violent wars the English have ever fought. By per capita, by deaths, this is the most violent war the English have fought. And in Ireland, it is really scary when the war eventually gets to Ireland, how many people die in Ireland. And the aftermath of the war is an interesting time period. And this one I find is very interesting in the development of the United States or our political thought. They start having a republic. And one part of that republic, they develop the treaties of government, which is a constitution. And it is divided into three parts, where you have the protector, Oliver Cromwell, who has quite a bit of power. You have Parliament, and then you have a third bit, which is supposed to, if there's conflict between the protector and Parliament, where the decisions are supposed to be solved, half of the members are supposed to be picked by Cromwell or the Lord Protector, and the other half by Parliament. I find that very interesting because that's sort of, when you look back to the Constitution and the three separate branches of government, you can say their origins trace back to this period. And when you look back on the Civil War, three important writers come that influence America in the 18th century. The first one is going to be Thomas Hobbes, who writes the Leviathan, and he talks about man in the state of nature, and that basically humans are evil, and you need a social contract to prevent wars and discord, which Hobbes had lived through. In fact, he had to escape Paris. And his thought monarchy was the best form of government. But the key thing is monarchs do not get their power from God. They get it from the people, the social contract. This is very controversial because the people who believe in the divine right of kings do not agree with this. Another person is Algernon Sidney, wrote the Discourse Concerning Government in 1683. And he is writing very clearly, the right to govern is vested in a government by the people. Without consent of the people, the king has no mandate to rule. So he is arguing strongly against the divine right of kings. And the other one, the one who's probably the most famous in this country, John Locke, who wrote 2 treatises of government in 1689, is government is a contract among the people to provide the laws to protect possessions and property. And he did not believe in a strong authoritative government, and he certainly does not believe in the divine right of kings. These ideas carry over to the future United States and become the building blocks of what is going to come later when we're working on the Constitution. So I think that is very fundamental. It also, unlike France, where Louis XIV is an authoritative king, after the Civil War, when the monarchy is restored and the kings come back, it is a constitutional monarchy. They have to abide by the laws. Even though Charles II and James II tried very much to get back to what their grandfather had, they did not succeed.
Couldn't you also argue that while the ideas of a lot of the 18th century political revolution sprung out of the 17th century, couldn't you also argue that it's only because of the discrete events happening in the 18th century itself, the unrest, the movement of people, the colonization, the domination of other groups, couldn't you argue that the 18th century stands on its own?
Yes, you can say that, but I think because they have seen that you can change government, that the people can rebel because it happened in the English Civil War, and you can also say it happened in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, that it validates what they are trying to do in the 1760s and 1770s. So I think that is a key point. They can see that it does happen. And a lot of historians have said that the ideas that they're fighting for in the Revolutionary War are very similar to what they're fighting in the English Civil War. And get into religion on one of those points. One of the big battles that the English are dealing with is how people should worship. Should there be a state church or not? And you start getting in the English Civil War an idea called liberty of conscience, where there shouldn't be a state church, that the churches should be independent and people should be able to worship how they want to. That carries over into the English colonies, into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Now, the last question I have, we've only skimmed the surface of what's going on in the 17th century, and we have to be careful because if not, we could be here forever and ever. And one of the mistakes we made is that this is a very broad topic, and usually when we do these podcasts, we're on a much more narrow focus where we can concentrate on one area. And this one, I feel that we're all over the place, or I'm all over the place. But there is a thought that the 21st century is like the 17th century. So what's your opinion on this, Rachel?
I will grant you that there are definitely some surface similarities of similar events occurring, which are also providing similar social reorganizations. I mean, we have a plague, we have war, we have economic issues, economic distress issues related to the other two. However, I would also argue that these are unique circumstances in every event because we have always had disease, we have always had war, we have always had economic hardships. Each one doesn't necessarily reflect the same conditions of the one that came before it.
I think with me, the biggest issue is that we are facing climate change. Not a colder world, a much, much warmer world. If we don't bring things under control, the long-term consequences of this, I can see it very easily happen in the 17th century where there are no answers. Governments do not know what to do. And you end up in wars that kind of make no sense whatsoever. I mean, one could argue that the war happening in Ukraine right now is really hard to explain why it's happening. And the thing that scares me, 1618 is when it really began to start falling apart in the 17th century in Europe. Now is when it's beginning to fall apart right here. But the one thing that is very, very different is that life is much, much better. We might have gone through a pandemic, but it was not like the plague. And if anyone wants to see if it is, We did a podcast on the plague in London, and there's a huge difference. Within a few months, 100,000 people are dead out of 400,000.
There's also, going along with the discrete circumstances for these similar events, yet not reflective events, is that, again, our technology is well beyond our medical technology, our global technology, our connectedness with the rest of the world. That's going to have a broader impact. Again, humankind faces the same type of situations over and over and over again. Unfortunately, it's just the nature of being alive and being biological organisms. However, we are coming to, as you said, a crisis point with some things that we cannot change because of our impact on the way we live. So this might be very interesting to keep an eye on, although I still don't know if I can say directly that 2022 and the 17th century are quite similar.
I am going to say, just because I do not want them to be similar, they are not, and that we can figure it out, and that we can make a much more peaceful century going forward.
So, on that depressing note, if you have enjoyed listening to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to subscribe, and be sure to keep an eye for future episodes. We are about halfway through our second season, and we will be adding some very interesting episodes very soon. Also, we have really interesting events coming up this season. If you want to come visit the museum, we have our French and Indian War event about refugees in the Valley. That's happening April 2nd and 3rd. We have our Wool Week events at the end of April through into May Day, which is also another event on May 1st. And from there, we go into a lot of different events with a lot of different themes and a lot of different focuses. So keep an eye on our calendar on our website as well.
Thank you very much, and please come and visit us at the museum.